4. Parker DeVood gripped the controls of his dropship with such force that his knuckles went dead white, while the blue orb hanging against the blackness of eternity grew larger with alarming speed. The velocity indicator on his panel told him that their speed was well above safe entry velocity. This was going to be a hairy landing, assuming he could make any landing at all. If he didn't do it right, the dropship would hit the atmosphere and skip off into space like a stone skipping across the surface of a pond. That was what would happen if DeVood played it too safe. And if he were too bold, if he took the dropship in at too great an angle, it would burn up as it passed through the atmosphere. The approach would have to be right on the money. There would be no second chance. And that was because of their approach speed and the structural damage to the ship. The struggle to break free from the gyrating carrier had warped the dropship's keel and ridgepole. At that very moment, the life support panel was showing that the hull was bleeding oxygen at kilograms per second. That wasn't an immediate problem because the ship carried hundreds of kilograms in reserve, but there'd be no time for a second pass if the first one failed. DeVood could seal the bridge compartment and let the cargo bay bleed. That would let him survive, but wouldn't make the troops very happy. Although life support concerns were a nagging concern for the future, they were unimportant to the hazardous present. DeVood nosed the ship down slightly to keep the planet's expanding rim just at the edge of the viewer. But the screen blanked out occasionally as the forward thrusters fired repeatedly in response to his commands to reduce velocity. With DeVood diverting fuel from the wing tanks to the forward holding area, the dropship shuddered as the thrusters fired again. Warning lights showed the level of fuel available, while the graph showed current rate of use indicated that nothing would be left for a final push. He cross-fed fuel from the maneuvering jets in the aft section to compensate for the increased expenditure forward. Off to the right, DeVood was aware of the lifeboat expelled by the Teledyne, but its existence had little meaning to him. He didn't care what happened to it, or its occupants, as long as they didn't interfere with his approach vector. The lifeboat was so small that the dropship could run over it with hardly a noticeable bump. But if it became entangled in some important part of the ship, the task of landing might become impossible. He hunched over the controls and watched the panels in front of him. He knew that the ship's instruments had been damaged by whatever the Teledyne had hit during its transition through hyperspace. Even though the numbers were going crazy, he'd been trained to trust instruments rather than his sight or his senses. Without an up or down in space, the instruments were the only consistent reference point a dropship pilot had. DeVood winced slightly as a comm panel screen to his right erupted in a shower of sparks, filling the flight deck with the acrid scent of burned insulation and ozone. Meanwhile, life support in the cargo bay was rapidly falling to a warning, if not critical, level. DeVood concentrated on the remaining micro-navigational screen. Inside the cargo bay, Vost and his men had finally gotten the 4 mechs and the Phoenix Hawk LAM under control. They'd managed to secure the 2 Locust mechs against the aft bulkhead, which had held them relatively stable during the pummeling immediately after the misjump. The other 2 mechs, a Javelin and a Panther, had come partially free from their storage along the bay's lateral perimeter. The Panther's right arm had broken the restraining shackle holding it against the exterior bulkhead, and even the hydraulics had not slowed its thrashing. Vost had had to climb over the scaffolding that composed much of the bay's interior to reach the mech's cockpit, where he'd clapped on his neurohelmet and fired up the machine to get it under control. If not for people being hurled across the bay, that task would have presented few problems. Desk Commander Yubari Takuda had braced himself at the rear of the cargo bay, just outside the door to his stateroom, and snapped on the safety tackles. From there, he could see and direct the members of his 4 desk sections as they wrestled with the hurtling objects. It was an interesting problem. An object in weightlessness was easy to move and control. That didn't mean the object had no mass, that it was like a balloon. It wasn't. Just because an object was weightless did not deprive it of mass. Even when weightless, a 500-kilogram weapons pack still had the mass of a 500-kilogram weapon pack. With the dropship constantly decelerating, the free objects in the cargo hold were falling toward the front of the ship. They weren't falling very fast, but they still had enough momentum to crush the unwary. Takuda hung in his place in the aperture, snapping orders and warnings into his headset. The desk team members were so well trained that they responded instantly to his curt commands. The mercenary mech pilots and their small technical support team were concentrated on their mechs and any objects that came near them. The rest of the flying objects were left to the responsibility of the desk members. That meant Takuda's people had to control not only their own material, but also the spare parts containers hurtling toward the forward bulkhead. They could have let them fly, but Takuda knew that the dropship's skin had been ruptured. He could hear the sibilant hiss of the escaping atmosphere. The thought of a steel box crashing into the bulkhead was not very reassuring. The dropship shuddered violently, threatening to tear loose all the newly secured equipment. Takuda, at first, felt the strain of the harness against his legs and chest, but the strain began to relax even though the shuddering increased. He was also aware of a growing sensation of heat. Throwing a glance toward the small vision port near the personnel access door, he saw that the ship's exterior had begun to glow with the heat of re-entry. Takuda was not an ostensibly religious man, but he said a short, silent prayer for himself and his team. To die in service to the Draconis Combine was an honorable death, but he knew that he had more to offer than merely becoming an unknown cinder in some unknown and forgotten corner of this galaxy. While these thoughts passed through Takuda's mind, the glow of the ship's outer skin increased, and with it, the heat inside the cargo bay. He saw his Talon Sergeant, Gunso George Cousteau, recoil from the side of the dropship as the heat penetrated his insulated combat suit. Takuda's own forehead and back were beginning to perspire. Hot air dried his mouth. He forced himself to breathe through his nose as much as possible. With the dropship now shuddering and bucking as violently as a bull, he would have been helpless except for the safety straps. On the bridge of the doomed dropship, Parker Davoud continued to fight the controls. The instruments exploded in sparkling fountains as system after system overloaded, overheated, and died. This was seat of the pants flying now, and Davoud had to strain every muscle to keep the hurling tonnage in a manageable configuration. He could see the approaching ground through the occasional gaps in the glare that swept across the forward view panel. There was no way to choose the best landing site. This would be a one-pass, dead-stick landing. Just above the edge of the panel, he saw an opening in the thick vegetation below. It wasn't nearly big enough to handle the Leopard-class dropship, but it was the only one in sight. Davoud pulled back hard on the control column, at the same time yawing the ship right and left to help bleed off speed. With every fiber in his body concentrated on getting the ship to the ground as close to one piece as possible, Davoud temporarily stopped breathing. There was simply no energy left for it. His heart may have stopped as well, but his brain, his arms, his legs, and his hands did not. As the dropship careened over the rooftops, the treetops, the lofty branches whipping against the underside of the fuselage, her captain extended the control flaps and began his landing flare. The nose of the dropship rose, speed and lift vanished. The nose dropped for the last time, and pilot Parker DeVood watched as the trees at the end of the grassy area rushed toward him. Then the belly of the ship struck the soft ground, and the ship plowed in. The nose buried itself for an instant, threatening to flip the ship over on its back. Then the lifting body shape took control, and the nose came horizontal, cutting a furrow in the ground and into the trees. It came to a stop. DeVood looked around the steaming cockpit. Smoke hung thickly in the small space, and there was an occasional eruption of sparks, as if one of the dying instruments were protesting this abrupt landing. Looking up at the checklist printed on the overhead above his seat, he began to go systematically down through the landing and shutdown procedure, reading aloud the command and then carrying out the order. It was becoming superfluous, but it had been done so many times that it was unthinkable not to do it now. The checklist complete, DeVood unsnapped the quick release on his harness and stood up. Only then did he realize how tense he'd been. His knees buckled under his weight, and he fell heavily against the master panel control. In the rear of the smoldering dropship, the personnel access doors had opened in response to DeVood's checklist procedure. Pouring through them were the desk members, their weapons locked, loaded, and ready. This was an alien planet, or what could be an alien planet, and they were going to be ready for anything. As they dropped to the ground, the team quickly spread out, 20 meters apart, taking up a fighting stance. Silence. Not a bird, not an animal, not a person, not a bug. Nothing. Silence. Then a terrible, rushing, thundering whirlwind. The desk commandos dropped to the ground and turned to face this unknown and unexpected attack. In a blaze of light, an object crashed through the tops of the trees whence they had come, and plowed into the ground along the same path they had just followed. It burrowed through the ground, expelling great clods of dirt and sod as it burrowed, ever closer to the dropship. It stopped a scant 100 meters short of the ship, a smoking tower of dirt, roots, and small trees. Takuda felt his heart pounding in his chest. Then suddenly he began to laugh. The monster that had attacked him from behind was the lifeboat of the Teledyne. He walked toward the fuming pile and was mildly surprised when he saw a figure emerge from the steam. He recognized Mark Jacobs, the dropship's chief engineer. Behind him came the navigator, Elizabeth Hund, supporting the Teledyne's master and commander on her arm. They were a bedraggled trio, and Takuda thought they looked worse than he did. At least, so he hoped. Takuda assumed command. While in space, he deferred to either DeVood or Bannon, but with solid ground now under their feet, he was the one in charge. The first priority was to organize some mercenaries and other survivors into salvage crews and to care for any wounded. Next, they would have to establish security around the perimeter. His own troops responded immediately to his orders, but Vost's mercenaries did not accept his authority. The mercs were under his control only until the time he delivered them to their new commander. Now they wanted to know what right he had to give them orders now. They also wanted to know if they were still on the Kirita payroll. The fierce looks on the faces of Takuda's armed men stifled those protests almost at birth, but the desk commander knew they would surface again. Who was paying for what was an interesting question he would have to think about. Meanwhile, he also had to meet with Bannon. Takuda approached the jump ship crew, where they were huddled with Parker DeVood under the belly of the dropship. Only Jacobs rose deferentially on his approach. DeVood had collapsed against the hull of the ship, and Hund was still dealing with the seemingly catatonic Bannon. Takuda came to a halt at Bannon's feet. "Where are we?" he asked, more abruptly than he would have liked, but seeing no reason to dance around the subject. Bannon raised his head and stared through the desk commander. "Where are we?" Takuda repeated harshly. Where? Where? Fumbled Bannon. "We could be anywhere. My instruments are all fried. They didn't tell me anything. He shrugged and then waved helplessly toward the silent forest beyond. We're not anywhere that's real, that's for sure. For all I know, we could be in one of those parallel universes the futurists are always inventing out of their warped imaginations. Same's true of my instruments, put in Davood. He reached up and patted the wrinkled metal of the cooling dropship. I don't know where we are either, but wherever it is, one thing's for sure. It's forever.